The US 10-year Treasury yields did something very, very odd the other day because of two things. One that a lot of people kind of anticipated, and one that a lot of people really aren't discussing too much. So let's dive into how the US Treasury yields skyrocketed in flight just after the jobs data was dropped. And we discussed that the other day on a live stream. But looky here, you don't see Treasury yields shoot up like this on simple news. So the ADP jobs report came out, and then it honestly just freaking skyrocketed up. Now, why did this happen, right? The US Treasury yields ticked higher after the latest jobs report was released, and it was on hotter than expected US jobs data. Investors breathed a sigh of relief that the US economy remains on solid footing. The 10-year Treasury yield added 11 basis points. Like, you don't see those kind of moves. And then the 2-year rose more than 11 basis points. The 30-year bond yields also rose 8 basis points. So all of these moves were huge on a single data point, or at least that's what everybody thinks. But the reality is after this giant move, it still ticked up because there was more bullish news that came out for the US economy following that. Now we'll get into that here in a minute. So let's stay on track with the payroll, the non-farm payrolls, because they rose by 139,000 jobs. And that might sound like a lot, even though the forecast was about 125,000. But the reality is that these treasury yields and these payroll numbers, they need to increase, and the amount of jobs need to increase every single month in order for the economy to be looked at as prosperous. Everything is going well underneath the hood. The reality of this situation is that there's more to these job numbers than really meets the eye. But investors are taking this, it seems like, at face value, and that's why you see these numbers go where they are. Now, on top of all that, the treasury yields are rising, and you're seeing these coming as the weekly jobless claims is the greatest level since October. Now, expectations are that the report should show a slower pace of hiring, with the economy forecast to have added 125 new jobs. Trade data from the Commerce Department showed that the U.S. deficit shrank in April, and everybody was kind of anticipating some pretty weak job numbers. Well, the reality is the job numbers weren't as weak as everybody expected. So that's why you see the treasury yields. And it's interesting because all of these data points that come out, the reality is that you see these things and then it's, hey, the jobs number weren't as bad as we thought. The predictions that we're making on the overall inflation numbers are not as crazy as we would think. So the reality is that all of these predictions really help move the market when they're just simply predictions. But the markets move on forecasting data. And there's other things that happened here fairly recently that also made this job data start to take off. And that is the US and China are going to be holding trade talks in London here this week after Trump and Xi Jinping had a nice phone call. There was a high-level delegation from the US and China, and they're meeting in London to try to shore up a fragile truce in a trade dispute that has roiled the global economy. What a word there, roiled. You don't see that one too often, but these delegations are going to try to try to shore up this trade dispute. So the Chinese delegation, led by Vice Premier Hai Lifeng, is due to meet the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and the Trade Representative Jameson Greer. So it's all going to be very interesting, right? Because China will send one. We're sending 3 of our guys out there. They also had negotiations in Geneva last month that brought the temporary respite to the trade war. The 2 countries announced May 12th that they had agreed to a 90-day suspension of the 100% plus tariffs that they both essentially opposed on each other. And now the other aspect of it is Trump also issued a travel ban to all of this, right? Where he's going to be hosting a roundtable of CEOs to highlight a provision of the GOP domestic policy bill that would seed $1,000 into investment accounts for newborn American children. So the US and China officials are meeting in London today. And this meeting will come after Trump and Xi Jinping discuss trade issues in a phone call. Trump will also host a roundtable that will give $1,000 investment into investment accounts for newborn Americans. And Gavin Newsom and other Democrats said Trump's deployment of the National Guard troops help quell protests in the city over immigration raids, will only escalate the situation after Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, threatened to arrest any government officials who impede federal efforts. A defiant Newsom responded, "So Tom, arrest me. Let's go." And Trump also put a travel ban, including for 12 countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, and 7 more countries that face visa restrictions, including Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela. Venezuela is an interesting one. If those of you guys who know what is going on all over Latin America, I'm sure that one comes to no surprise. But the reality is that these trade talks and the delays are interesting timing, right? I mean, it's something that's been developing over this time period. Everybody's been keeping all eyes on China and the US and how these trade relations are going to be working themselves out, is, I guess, a good way to put it at this point in time. Because the reality of the situation is that Donald Trump thought that China was taking the US to the woodshed, that all of these trade talks, they're big, there are a ton of issues. And the reality of the situation is that, hey, Trump thinks that we were getting killed in these trade wars. They wanted to out China as a bad actor. And what did they do? They imposed heavy bans on the Chinese. And they said, hey, you know what? With all of this, we think that you guys were the bad actors in all of this, and we need to now put these tariffs on you and basically teach China a lesson. But the reality is everybody was saying stuff about Trump's taco trade. Trump always chickens out, I believe, was the taco lingo there. But either way, a U.S. and China trade talk will now take place as Trump and Xi Jinping are now meeting, and a top U.S. and Chinese official are now meeting. The two sides are aiming to build on preliminary trade talks in Geneva, which lowered the temperature between Washington and Beijing and offered a relief for investors battered by months of Trump's global trade war. Look, this by months is crazy. Trump has been doing this trade war he's been a president for, let's see, not even like 6 months at this point. He got into office January 20th. And so because of that, he's not even been in the presidency for 6 months. But hey, these Trump trade wars have been going on for, quote, months. It's crazy. The narrative around all this stuff is crazy. But the reality is investors thought, okay, you see the jobs report. It's not, it's better than expected, right? The things aren't breaking. Trump and Xi Jinping, they're meeting to solve all these things. So how do the investors react? There's a 99.9% chance that they are not going to cut. So that's why you see these Treasury bonds react in the way that they are, right? But the interesting aspect is that we're still seeing the Dixie, which means the strength of the dollar relative to other fiat currencies. It isn't, skyrocketing up. The strongest we saw the dollar since we started doing these live streams with you guys nearly 2 months ago at this point, we saw that get up to 101. And now we're starting to see it fall back down under that 99 mark. We saw it got to the lowest to 98.5, but we're starting to see it come back up just so slightly, right? And this is just on the news of all of these different things. And everybody else around the globe is cutting interest rates except for the United States. So I think the dollar is going to start to creep up some more and gain some more strength. But the reality is that, investors are always going to be forward looking. So with the talks of, the trade talks that are going to be taking place today, we're seeing the S&P 500 have about an even day because of that, right? So just about even on the day. The news were somewhat bullish during the day. Therefore, we saw everything start to creep up a little bit. But all these investors are saying, hey, this isn't sustainable. So the market overall just ended the day right about flat. Nothing too crazy, nothing too special, right? We're not seeing the volatility that we're seeing in the in the US Treasury yields. We're not seeing that right now in the 10-year Treasury. We're not seeing these, giant spikes up that, occurs in 30 minutes time. And the reality is these Treasury yields are just reactive on a lot of the news that is coming out. And the Treasury yields that are the news that is coming out is somewhat bullish on the US keeping things pretty high, right? So I think that we're going to start to see more of the volatility start to come out. And it's going to be an interesting week, really dependent on what comes out of the Trump and Xi Jinping meeting here in the next few days. So be sure to stay tuned on this channel because I'm going to be following closely. I reported on the jobs numbers when they came out, but the Treasury bond yields didn't react as drastically right when I was recording that video. I wanted to do a full breakdown on just the jobs report. So make sure you're smoking that like Cheech and Chong, and you hit the subscribe button. Literally 95% of you guys that watch this channel do not subscribe. Please help your boy out. Subscribe to the channel. Help me get to 1,000 subs as soon as possible because I'm working hard to bring you guys as much great content as possible. So I will catch you guys all at the next one.